Have you ever wondered what makes us fear the unknown more than the dark itself? It's not the absence of light. It's what might be waiting in it. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether this is your first time joining us or you've settled in with these stories before, there's something special about finding a quiet corner of the night and letting it breathe with you. I'm Mr. Dantello, and tonight we're exploring abandoned places and lost locations, those forgotten spaces that linger in our minds long after we've left them behind. These aren't just empty buildings. They're places where something doesn't quite add up, where absence itself becomes a presence. Our first story is called The Abandoned Mill, Where My Shift Still Clocks In Without Me. A tale of work that continues in the dark, whether you're there to do it tonight. Then we move into the Derelict Motel, where every room holds my suitcase unpacked, a place where arrival and departure blur into something unsettling. And we'll finish with the Overgrown Subdivision, where one house has all my furniture inside, a story about finding yourself where you never meant to be found. If you've been enjoying these stories, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking and subscribing. It helps more people discover this little corner of the night. Now, get yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let yourself settle into that space between waking and sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The Abandoned Mill, Where My Shift Still Clocks In Without Me. The key still turns in the lock, though I haven't used it in 7 months. That's the first thing that strikes me as wrong. Not impossible. I never returned my key when I left the mill. I'd stuffed it into a box of papers that went into my closet, and there it stayed, unclaimed and unremarkable. Until this morning, when I remembered my grandmother's watch. She'd given it to me the week before everything at the mill fell apart, and I'd taken it off in the break room one afternoon, setting it on the shelf above my locker. 7 months. I bought other watches since then, cheaper ones. But I'd been thinking about her, and I wanted it back. The mill hasn't changed. That sounds like nothing, but it's everything. Abandoned buildings are supposed to deteriorate visibly. They're supposed to look hurt, windows breaking inward under their own weight, paint peeling in long geometric strips, weeds pushing through foundation cracks like something's trying to escape from underneath. But when I push through the front entrance, my key still turning smooth and decisive in the mechanism, the first thing I notice is that nothing has moved. The parking lot is empty, gravel and pothole, with grass that's grown thin and deliberate in the spaces between. Not wild growth, just the slow reclamation that happens when you stop caring. A single chain-link fence surrounds the property. It's still intact. The mill itself rises 4 stories of red brick, the kind that was expensive when it was built in the 1920s, now just old in a way that looks permanent. Most of the windows are intact, which is the uncanny part. I would have expected vandals, teenagers with rocks, the simple entropy of a place nobody's watching. But the glass is whole, filmed over with dust so thick I can't see through it. And the frames are still painted that institutional gray that feels like it predates memory. The air inside tastes like metal and time. The entrance opens into what used to be the production floor, the heart of everything. This is where the looms were, dozens of them arranged in rows, and where most of us worked, standing in the same spot for 8 hours, feeding cloth through machines that had already seen 50 years of this work before I was born. The looms are still here, every single one. They're enormous things, iron frames and moving parts, and they're covered in a uniform layer of dust so settled and undisturbed that for a moment I can't quite believe I'm really standing here. It's like the whole room has been holding its breath. No footprints. I look for footprints and find none. The light comes from the upper windows, gray and filtered through the dirt, and it catches all the suspended particles in the air, making the whole space look like it's underwater. I stand there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, and I realize I'm listening. There's no sound at all. No ambient hum from machinery. The power's been off for months, everyone knows that. No rats or insects. No settling and creaking. It's a silence so complete it has texture. I should find the break room. The stairs are along the eastern wall where they've always been. I remember the route exactly, which unsettles me more than I want to admit. 7 months away. And my body still knows where to go. The muscle memory of a place you've left is different than nostalgia. It's automatic and underneath thought. The way your tongue finds a missing tooth. The stairs are metal, industrial, painted that same gray. They don't creak when I climb them, which surprises me. I'd expected at least that. Some sound, some acknowledgement that something is moving through this space. But my footsteps are muffled by the dust coating, and the railing is cold under my palm, and I make my way to the second floor without hearing anything at all. The second floor is administrative. This is where the supervisors kept their offices, where the time clock was mounted on the wall, where the payroll ledgers were kept in a filing cabinet that was older than anyone could remember. The machinery sounds were distant here, muted by distance and walls, and it was the quietest place in the mill, the place where you could almost think. I never spent much time here. No reason to. My business was with the clock when I was leaving. That brief moment at the end of shift when you pulled your time card from the slot and felt the punch strike through the thin cardboard like a period at the end of a sentence. The clock is here, still mounted on the wall above where the filing cabinet used to be, still waiting. And the moment I see it, I know something is wrong. The display is digital, which is wrong all by itself. When I worked here, we used a mechanical punch clock, the kind with the numbered slots and the heavy lever that would stamp the time and date into cardboard. But this face is LCD, LED. I don't even know the specific technology, something modern, something that couldn't have been here before. The numbers glow a faint amber color in the gray light, reading 9:47 a.m., and beneath that, today's date. Correct down to the day. I move closer. The clock's face is clean, no dust, That's the detail that stops me cold. Everything else in this place is coated in 7 months of undisturbed settling, but the clock face is clean as new glass. Someone has wiped it. Recently, the time cards are in the slots beneath the clock face, and they're organized the way they always were. Last names. Rows of thin rectangles with names printed in a slightly faded blue ink. I can read some of them from here. Turner, Rodriguez, Quan, Hall, Davies, and there. In the fifth slot from the left, mine, Morgan, I reach for it before I've fully decided to, and the moment my fingers touch the edge of the card, I'm struck by how light it is. Thinner than I remember. When I pull it free from the slot, I can see the punch marks, the dates and times stamped on the front in small, precise rectangles. Most of them are old. My last day was in February. The timestamps go back to when I started, nearly 3 years ago. They're all there, a complete record of my presence marked in punch holes. But there's a mark I don't remember, a recent one. This morning's date, 9:15 a.m. I stare at it for a long time. There's no reason I should be confused. People make mistakes. Perhaps the clock wasn't completely powered down. Perhaps someone came in here months ago and didn't realize it was still running, left some kind of battery backup. Perhaps this is a dream, and I'm still asleep. And my brain is doing that thing where it generates plausible-seeming explanations for impossible details. But I know it's not a dream. The card is real. The mark is real. The ink is fresh enough that if I run my thumbnail over it, I can feel where it slightly raised the paper. Something has been recording my time here on a day I haven't been in this place since February. The break room is on the 3rd floor. I put my card back into its slot and climb further up. The stairwell is narrower on the upper floors. The industrial gray paint peels in long, papery strips, and my footsteps echo in a way that makes me hyper-aware of the sound, how each step hits the concrete and multiplies itself upward through the empty building. I find myself moving slower, as if deliberate slowness might somehow make me less real here, less present to whatever occupies this space. By the time I reach the 3rd floor landing, my breathing has become something I'm monitoring. This is a learned response from childhood, the way you instinctively quiet yourself in silence so profound it becomes a presence of its own. The break room door is still there, paint chipped, the small rectangular window opaque with accumulated grime on the inside. I push it open and the hinges protest, a long creaking complaint that seems to reverberate down the hall behind me. The room hasn't changed in the 7 months since the shutdown. The small refrigerator sits against the far wall, unplugged and slightly ajar. We all cleaned out our things before the final day, but someone had left behind a Tupperware container on the bottom shelf. I'd meant to throw it out. By the time I came back later that afternoon to do it, someone else had already closed the door. I'd never looked inside. The table where we ate lunch is still there, the 4 plastic chairs pushed in around it with the precision of a place that had been abandoned rather than simply left. On the wall above the sink, The bulletin board still holds the remnants of what used to be our collective moment-to-moment lives. A notice from February reminding everyone to clean up after themselves. A reminder about the benefits enrollment period that had passed months ago, and below it, a handwritten note someone had pinned up. I squint at it from the doorway. It's written in a hand I recognize. Not my own, but familiar. Alex's handwriting, the engineer who worked the North Line. The note says, "Please restock paper towels in bathroom. Thanks. The date on it is today's date." I step into the room fully and read it again. The ink is black ballpoint pen, the kind we always used from the supply drawer. The paper is a standard memo sheet, yellow with a lined pad. There's nothing worn about it, nothing suggesting it's been sitting here for months. The corner isn't bent. The paper isn't yellowed beyond the inherent color of memo paper. It looks like it was written this morning. I take it off the bulletin board carefully and turn it over. The back is blank. When I bring it close to my face, I can smell the faint chemical scent of ballpoint ink. Nothing degraded or aged about it. My hands have begun to shake in a way that doesn't yet feel voluntary. The bathroom is adjacent to the break room. I push open the door and step inside. The fluorescent light still somehow managing to remain off even though the grid switches are by the entrance. My eyes take a moment to adjust to the dimness. The window is small, and most of the light comes from the break room behind me. The towel dispenser by the sink is empty. This fact registers in a strange way. It's simultaneously the most mundane thing I've encountered and the most disturbing. An empty paper towel dispenser in an abandoned mill. Of course it's empty. Of course no one has restocked it. But Alex's note said it as though she expected someone would. There's a roll of paper towels on top of the toilet tank. New. The plastic packaging is intact, unbent, not faded. I stand there for what feels like a very long time, staring at it. Then I look at the small wire dispenser above the sink. The mechanism still works. I test it with my finger, and it spins freely, dispensing the metal holder with a soft clicking sound. I don't open the new roll. I don't install it. I simply leave the bathroom and return to the break room, where I place Alex's note back on the bulletin board in exactly the position where I found it. Back to the stairs. Back down. I'm not thinking about where I'm going. I'm simply moving through the building like something is drawing me through it. And I'm following because stopping seems worse than continuing. The main floor holds the production line. This is where I spent most of my hours when I worked here, checking assembly points, logging production numbers, coordinating with the shift supervisors and the line operators. The massive machines are silent now, their moving parts stilled. They're coated in the kind of dust that only accumulates over months of absolute disuse, a fine gray coating that makes everything look prehistoric. Entombed, except for one section of the line. It's Station 7, roughly in the middle of the production floor. The area around it is clear, not just clear of dust, actively, meticulously clean. The concrete floor is darker here, cleaned with water recently enough that it hasn't fully dried. The machine itself is spotless, its metal surfaces gleaming slightly under the diffused morning light. The safety rails around it are polished. The control panel has been wiped down. The readout screen, which hasn't displayed anything in 7 months, now shows a cursor blinking steadily in the lower left corner. I approach it slowly. Each step I take leaves a mark in the dust of the surrounding floor, a small footprint that makes my presence here absurdly, irrefutably real. The readout screen shows, "Welcome Morgan" beneath it. A blinking line waits for input. I stand there for what might be several minutes. I'm aware of my breathing in a way that's becoming difficult to ignore. It's too fast, too shallow. I'm aware of every small sound the building makes, the distant settling of its framework, the metallic click of cooling systems, the faint whisper of what might be wind or might be something else moving through the ventilation shafts. The cursor continues to blink. On, off, patient, I turn away from the machine and walk back toward the main entrance. My intention is to leave, to get out of this place and drive home and try to understand what's happening from some place where the walls aren't watching me. But as I pass the security office, a small walled compartment off the main production floor with a desk and filing cabinets and monitors that all went dark months ago, I see that the door is open. It wasn't open when I walked in. I know this with absolute certainty. I came in through the main entrance, which is 40 feet from the security office. The door was closed then. It was closed because the building has been closed. No one has been here. Except, of course, someone has been here. Someone is here. The thought doesn't panic me. I notice this about myself with strange detachment, as if I'm observing my own response to this situation from somewhere outside my body. Instead of panic, I feel something closer to inevitability. The way you feel in a dream when you're moving towards something you know you shouldn't approach, but the dream logic doesn't permit escape or resistance. I push the security office door open wider. The monitors that line the far wall are off, but the chair at the desk has been turned around to face the door, to face the point where I would enter. It's the kind of chair we all used in our offices, ergonomic, on wheels, upholstered in faded gray fabric. I don't remember if it was here before or if someone has brought it here recently, and I realize that I should care about this detail more than I do. On the desktop, directly in the center, is an employee handbook. Our handbook. The thick blue binder that every employee received on their first day. The one that outlined policies and procedures and emergency protocols. We never read it. No one reads these things. But I had mine for 3 years. The handbook is open to a page I can't quite read from the doorway. I step inside the security office. The air feels colder here. Or maybe I'm imagining that. Maybe everything I'm sensing is being filtered through a layer of fear that's thickening around me like water. The page it's open to is titled Shift Extensions and Recurring Scheduling. There's a passage underlined in yellow highlighter. The handwriting in the margin is mine, or a very precise copy of it. The note says, "Read this when you return." The message is dated not today, but 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before I came to the mill. 2 weeks before I decided to return to this place for reasons I still haven't clearly articulated to myself. I close the handbook. I don't read the underlined passage. Some things I'm beginning to understand are worse when you understand them. Some ignorances protect you in ways that knowledge cannot. I'm walking toward the exit when I hear it, the soft sound of a time clock being punched. Not a modern electronic clock, the old mechanical kind. The heavy click of a card sliding into its slot, the decisive stamp of the punch mechanism. It comes from the break room upstairs. It comes from the time clock on the wall. My hand is on the main exit door. The glass is so caked with dust that I can barely see through it to the parking lot beyond. I'm aware that I could leave right now. Simply walk out and close the door and drive away and try to convince myself that this was some kind of elaborate hallucination or waking dream or nervous breakdown in physical form. But I already know that whatever this is, it isn't finished with me. And I think, with a clarity that frightens me more than any of the impossible things I've seen, that it might never be finished. That maybe I've already stayed too long. The click of the time clock reverberates in my mind as I climb back up to the second floor. The break room hasn't changed in the 3 years since I worked here, which somehow makes it worse than if it had deteriorated. The same laminate table sits in the corner, its surface still bearing the pale rings from 1,000 coffee cups. The same generic landscape prints hang on the walls, mountains at sunset, a river through autumn woods. The microwave sits dormant on its shelf. Everything waits. The time clock is mounted on the wall beside the refrigerator, an ancient mechanical device with a row of numbered slots for punch cards. Card number 7 is partially inserted in the slot. I don't remember whose number I had been. The detail seems trivial now, but I find myself trying to recall it anyway, some fragment of routine that might anchor me to a version of myself that existed before this began. The number escapes me. I approach the clock slowly. My breathing sounds loud in the silence. The card in slot 7 is yellowed, curled at the edges. I pull it free and look at the timestamps. The dates are unreadable, faded to pale gray impressions on the cardstock. But the pattern is clear. In and out, the metronomic rhythm of shifts completed. Except the last line doesn't have an out time. The card simply ends, suspended mid-shift, waiting for a punch that never came. I look at my hands. I'm holding the card, and my hands are shaking with a fineness that feels separate from fear. It's as though my nervous system is responding to something my conscious mind hasn't yet processed. That's when I notice the other cards. All the slots are filled. The cards overlap slightly where they've been crammed in, some bent at sharp angles from the pressure. I begin pulling them out one by one. They're all blank. Not old, not yellowed, blank, fresh card stock, pure white, unmarked, dozen after dozen of them, each one bearing no trace of use, no stamps or times recorded. Except one. In slot 12, at the far end of the clock, is a card that bears a single timestamp, today's date. This morning at 6:47 a.m., the exact moment I pushed open the mill's front doors to come inside. The entry time is recorded. There is no corresponding exit. I set the car down on the break room table with a deliberation that feels absurd given the circumstances. My mind is performing a kind of triage, separating what can be rationalized from what cannot. The building is empty. I have seen no one else. The time clock is mechanical and hasn't been connected to power in years. I would have seen the outlet, the cord, something to indicate function. These facts form a baseline of sense, and anything that contradicts them is simply not possible. Yet the card bears an impression made by a machine. The punch is clean and clear. I walk to the refrigerator. I don't know what I'm expecting to find, only that there's a momentum to this now, a logic of dread that propels me forward regardless of what rational voice remains in my head. The refrigerator door opens with a soft, sucking sound. The seal is still intact, still working. The interior is dark and cold, empty except for a carton of milk that sits on the middle shelf. The date stamped on the side is from 2 weeks ago. I close the door and lean against it. The air in the break room has acquired a quality that makes it difficult to breathe. Not suffocating exactly, there's plenty of oxygen. I can draw it into my lungs without effort. But something about it feels wrong, stale, as though it's been recycled and used too many times, exhaled by something other than human lungs and then made available to me as if it were a courtesy. The footsteps begin on the floor above. They're unmistakable now. I'm far past the point where I can pretend they're settling beams or wind in the structure or any of the other explanations I offered myself on the first floor. These are footsteps. Someone walking across the third floor, moving slowly, deliberately, from the east side of the building toward the center. They stop directly above me. I remain motionless against the refrigerator, listening to the silence that settles like dust. Then, very distinctly, I hear the sound of a chair being pulled across the floor above. It drags with a series of jerking movements, and I can envision the arc of the path, from somewhere near what would have been the administrative desk toward the window that overlooks the parking lot, toward where my car is parked. The footsteps resume. They're moving faster now, and there's a rhythm to them that suggests pacing. Back and forth across the wooden floor of the third level. The pace increases. The rhythm breaks. There's a sound, not quite a crash, but something falling, something solid impacting the floor with force. Then silence. I push away from the refrigerator and climb the stairs to the third floor. The fire exit door that I thought about earlier is now open, hanging inward on its hinges. The stairs beyond it are dark, dropping down into a lower level. The basement, maybe, or a subfloor I hadn't been aware of. The wind comes up through the opening, carrying with it the smell of water and something organic, something that's been rotting in darkness for a very long time. The office that I imagined I remembered, the corner office with the window, is in chaos. Papers are scattered across the floor, torn from files and scattered as if by a deliberate hand, creating a trail that leads from the desk to the open fire exit. The chair I heard dragging is tipped on its side. On the floor, partially obscured by the papers, is an ID badge. I don't want to touch it. My body refuses the order for several long seconds before my legs move forward anyway, my hand reaching down toward the badge. It's been here a long time. The plastic is warped and discolored, the lamination peeling at the edges. The photograph on the badge shows a face I recognize. It's mine, not similar, not a resemblance. My face, precisely as it was 3 years ago, my eyes staring directly at the camera with that blend of uncertainty and resignation that everyone has in their employee ID photo. The name printed beneath the photograph is mine as well, and underneath that, in printed letters, status, active. The badge is dated 3 years ago, the date I stopped coming to the mill, the date I left and never returned until today. Except I'm looking at evidence that suggests I never left, that I've been here the entire time, clocking in and out, working shifts in this abandoned place, my life occurring in the hours I can't remember, the time that passes while I'm not paying attention. I hear it again, the sound of the punch clock from the floor below, the heavy metal stamp echoing up through the wooden structure of the mill. It sounds different this time, deliberate, purposeful, as though whatever is operating the clock is demonstrating its function specifically for me, making sure I understand what's happening. A shift is ending. Someone has finally clocked out, and the terrible realization settles over me with the weight of something physical. I still haven't left the building. The punch that marked my entrance this morning is waiting for its companion. The machinery that maintains these records is patient. It can wait as long as it needs to. The mill is exactly where it's always been, still and waiting and utterly indifferent to whether I walk out through the glass doors or whether my badge eventually bears 2 timestamps, an entry and nothing else. Another card to be filed in the slots of that ancient clock, another life suspended in the moment between clocking in and the moment you realize you may never clock out. The stairs behind me creak under the weight of my descent, but I don't remember climbing them. The glass doors opened. I don't remember deciding to move toward them, don't remember crossing the warehouse floor or descending the stairs or navigating back through the offices. But the night air hit my face, and I was standing on the loading dock, my shoes on concrete that had begun to crack under the patience of seasons I couldn't count. The parking lot stretched before me, empty except for my car, the only vehicle that had ever been here. I drove with both hands on the wheel, not trusting my instincts. The roads back into the city appeared gradually, as if they were being drawn into existence by my movement through space. Normal things, streetlights, other cars. A gas station where I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too badly to keep the wheel steady. It's been 5 days. 5 days of going to work at my office job, the one in the steel building downtown where there are other people and fluorescent lights and the ordinary weight of being observed. 5 days of eating meals I don't fully taste. 5 days of pretending that I don't check my doorway every time I wake up, confirming that I'm not back in the mill, that the walls surrounding me are actually walls and not the slowly breathing interior of something much larger. My therapist, I found one, went to her on the second day, asked me if I was experiencing dissociation. She used clinical language, memory gaps, sleep disturbance, intrusive thoughts. She asked me if I had been to the mill before, and when I told her yes, years ago, she nodded as though this explained something. She suggested that I had always been disturbed by the place, that my mind had constructed an elaborate anxiety dream to process that disturbance, and that the nightmare had felt so vivid because my subconscious is very creative. I let her believe that. It's easier than the alternative. What I didn't tell her is that I called the mill on the third day. I was at work, my actual work, the legitimate job with colleagues who exist in the same dimension I do, and I found myself looking up the number for the mill's corporate office. The company that owns it, the holding company that purchased it from the textile company after the textile company went bankrupt. I got transferred 3 times before reaching someone in facilities management, a man named Blake, whose voice suggested he was reading from notes about a building he'd never seen. The mill's been closed since 2003, he told me. Scheduled for demolition next year, assuming the asbestos remediation doesn't delay everything. I asked him about the records, the time clock system, whether anyone had ever reported unusual activity there, or if it was ever rented out, or if there were maintenance visits. No one goes there, Blake said. Insurance won't allow it. The structure's unstable. Why are you asking? I hung up. That night, I lay in bed and listened to my apartment settle around me. The radiator clanked. The refrigerator hummed. Ordinary sounds. Innocent sounds. And somewhere beneath them, so faint I might have been imagining it, the distant heavy stamp of a punch clock marking time. I haven't slept properly since. My doctor prescribed something, a mild sedative. I take it every night and lie very still, waiting to wake up somewhere else. So far, I wake up in my own bed. But there's a quality to the darkness that feels familiar. There's a weight to it that suggests it's been waiting. At work, I've started noticing things. Small things. In my email inbox, there's a message sent from my account to the facilities management office at the mill. It was sent during the hours I'm not awake. The message is blank, no subject line, no body, just a message to a department that manages a building that hasn't been occupied in over 20 years. I reported it to it. They said it came from my IP address, my login, my device. They looked at my screens like I was the suspicious one. I changed all my passwords. Enabled 2-factor authentication. None of it feels like it matters. On the 4th day, I noticed something else. On the drive home from my office, as I passed a particular intersection, I recognized the geometry of it, the angle of the stop sign, the way the light fell across the pavement. It was the same configuration as the path to the mill, not the actual path, but the mathematical shadow of it. The blueprint of that approach translated into a different urban geography. I took a different route home. But there are other intersections, other atmospheric expansion. The mill stood at the edge of the old highway like a rotting tooth. I'd driven past it 100 times before that day, maybe more. The kind of building you see without really seeing it. Your eyes sliding off its edges the way they do with things that don't quite belong to the present anymore. But I'd never been inside before. Not until they called me back. The smell hit first when I pushed through what used to be the loading dock door. Not decay exactly, something more complex than that. It was the accumulated breath of decades. Dust layered so thick it had its own mineral quality, like inhaling powdered stone. Mixed in was something chemical and acrid that probably came from the old dyes they used to process here. Stains that had seeped into the floorboards and walls and never quite evaporated, even after 40 years of standing empty. The chemical smell made my eyes water a little, but I didn't leave. Something about it felt important that I stay, that I breathe it in and let my body adjust to this place's particular atmosphere. The light inside was wrong. Not dark. There was plenty of light filtering through the broken skylights and cracks in the corrugated metal roof. But it was fractured light, scattered light. It came down in dusty columns that made the air itself visible, turning the empty space into something you could almost touch. The light seemed to lose energy as it moved through the layers of dust and debris, growing softer and stranger the further from the source it traveled, until by the time it reached the far corners of the main floor, it was just a kind of grayish dimness, the color of old photographs. I stood still for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust, and slowly the room began to resolve around me. The machinery was still there. Not all of it. They'd salvaged what they could when they shut the place down in the early 80s. But enough remained to create this strange landscape of metal and rust. The great looms sat like the skeletons of enormous insects, their frames still impressive even in decay. Shafts and pulleys extended from one end of the building to the other, a mechanical choreography frozen mid-motion. Some of them were tangled with remnants of the old cloth that had been processed here. Threads rotted to the consistency of gossamer, hanging from the machinery like the abandoned webs of ancient spiders. Everything was the color of rust and dust and time, ochre, rust brown, dull gray, the occasional flash of metal where something had worn through the oxidation. The floor was wooden, or had been. In most places it was still intact, just darkened with years of absorbed machine oil and whatever else had been spilled here over the decades. But in patches it had warped and buckled, creating slight hills and valleys in the surface. In other spots, boards had simply rotted through entirely, and you could see down into the space beneath, darker, damper, the air rising from below carrying an earthier smell. The wood creaked under my weight unpredictably. Sometimes my steps made sound, sometimes they didn't. I found myself watching the floor constantly, not out of fear of falling, but out of a strange desire to understand the mill's rhythms, to predict where and how it would respond to my presence. The walls were brick, old brick, possibly a century old, the kind that's been softened and darkened by decades of industrial process. Windows ran along two sides, and the light that came through them was amber-tinted, distorted by decades of grime and the way the glass had begun to sag and warp in its frames. Some panes were missing entirely, leaving gaps where I could feel the outside air moving through, bringing with it the smell of the dead grass and overgrown brush that had taken over the grounds. That outside air moved through the mill's interior like the building was breathing, slow, deep, patient breaths. There were benches where the workers had sat during their shifts, long wooden benches with worn surfaces, grooved where thousands of hands had gripped them while bodies settled onto them in the early morning darkness. Some of the benches had overturned, others sat in neat rows as though the workers had just stepped away for lunch and never returned. I found myself imagining the weight of all those bodies, all that attention, all that time compressed into the wood. The mill seemed to remember it. Scattered across the floor and work surfaces were remnants of the last day of operation. A coffee cup, ceramic, positioned as though someone had set it down intending to finish it. The coffee obviously had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark, concentric stain at the bottom of the cup, like a fossil. A pair of work gloves, gray and stiff with age, the fingers curled slightly as though still holding the shape of hands. A few old newspapers, their headlines faded to near illegibility, the paper itself so brittle it crumbled if you touched it. A thermos dented on one side. A radio, battery-operated, its plastic case yellowed and cracking. The light continued to change as I moved deeper into the space. It became more diffuse, more melancholic. The silence accumulated around me like a physical presence. I'd expected the place to feel still, but it wasn't still exactly. It was listening. That's the only way I can describe it. It was the kind of silence you feel when you're being paid attention to. It made my skin prickle slightly. Nothing I could definitively call fear, but something adjacent to it. A kind of heightened awareness that the space was aware of me. The temperature dropped as I moved toward the center of the building. Not dramatically, but noticeably. My breath began to mist slightly, even though it wasn't particularly cold outside. The mill was holding on to a chill, preserving it somehow, keeping it like a secret in its depths. The cold seemed to rise from the spaces beneath the floorboards. From the basement level, I could sense but not yet see. Cold and the smell of something older than the chemical reek of the dyes, something organic and quiet, like the smell of soil after rain, or stone that hasn't seen light in years. The machinery created a kind of visual maze. To move from one side of the floor to the other, I had to navigate between looms and shafts, ducking under pulleys that hung at head height, their cables drooping slightly, creating loops that your eye might pass through but your head had to avoid. Several times I misjudged the space, bringing my hand up to touch something before realizing I'd nearly walked into it. The metal was cold and rough beneath my fingers, crusted with rust that came away slightly, leaving an orange tint on my skin. I noticed there were patterns in where things had settled. The dust on horizontal surfaces wasn't uniform. It was deeper in some places than others, suggesting that the air moved through the mill in particular channels, creating rivers of circulation. Some surfaces seemed almost polished smooth by the passage of air over decades, while others were crusted thick with undisturbed accumulation. This pattern-making was strangely beautiful in its own way, like watching the evidence of wind made visible. The skylights, as I studied them more carefully, were creating a kind of shifting illumination. Clouds must have been moving outside, because the angle and intensity of light shifted gradually as I stood still. Nothing dramatic, just a slow dimming and brightening, as though the mill was being breathed in and breathed out by some enormous, invisible presence above it. The effect was hypnotic. I found myself standing still for long periods, just watching the way the light moved across the worn surfaces of things, revealing details that had been hidden moments before, then obscuring them again. There was water damage in one corner where the roof had leaked for years. The wood had swollen and darkened, and a kind of rust-colored stain bloomed outward across the bricks like a slow-motion explosion frozen in stone. Ice had formed there in winter again and again, working its way into cracks and expanding, widening them, year after year. The wall had begun to give up its structural integrity, and I could see the precise process of its failure documented in the layered brick and mortar. The way the damage had progressed, the seasons marked out in the progression of decay. I moved slowly through the space, my footsteps marking time in a place where time had essentially stopped. But it wasn't really stopped, I realized. It was still moving here, just very slowly. The mill was aging, degrading, being reclaimed, but it was happening at a pace so gradual that human perception couldn't quite catch it in the moment. Standing inside it, I was witnessing a process that required decades to become visible, the conversion of human space back into something else, something closer to nature, something closer to nothing. The silence seemed to deepen the longer I stood there. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the overgrown grounds, occasionally rattling loose panels on the exterior wall. Somewhere, a metal section groaned slightly, expanding or contracting in response to some infinitesimal change in temperature. My own breathing seemed amplified in the quiet. I was aware of every inhalation, every exhalation, the way my body was adding life to this dead space. And underneath it all, waiting at the edges of my attention, was that sound. The one I'd been hearing my entire shift, the one that had driven me to come back here in the first place. The faint, impossible sound of the machinery, not loud enough to be entirely real, not quiet enough to be purely imagination. It was there, though, just beneath the surface of the silence. The particular rhythm and pitch of the old looms, the way they'd sound during operation, filtered through time and distance and the spaces between things. It wasn't getting louder. It wasn't getting closer. But it wasn't going away. Either I found myself standing very still, my hands at my sides. My attention narrowed to a single point. The mill held me there, suspended in its particular time and temperature and light. I was aware of every surface around me, every shadow, every shaft of dusty illumination. I was aware of my own solidity, my own presence as something strange and warm and out of place in this cooling, graying space. The afternoon wore on. I'm not sure how long I actually stood there. Hours passed in the mill in a way that didn't quite align with normal time. The light continued to shift, slowly crossing the floor in the manner of a sundial. The temperature continued to drop. The silence continued to wait. And underneath it all, that sound continued. Patient, rhythmic, impossible. The mill was not empty. I understood that now with complete certainty. Not haunted, exactly. That word carried too much weight, too much drama, but not empty. Something was here, had always been here, remained here in the spaces between the machinery and the dust and the slow decay. Something that marked time in longer intervals than human measurement. Something that had been waiting, perhaps, for me to return. I stood in the amber light and dust, feeling the weight of the mill's attention, and I did not move. Places where the same geometry appears, waiting to be recognized. This morning, I found my employee ID badge in my coat pocket. I don't know when I put it there. I don't remember retrieving it from the mill. But the plastic is still warped. The date is still 3 years old. The photograph is still me, my expression still caught in that moment between resignation and the slow beginning of understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The lamination is beginning to peel further at the edges. I keep it on the desk beside my bed, telling myself it's evidence, proof that something happened, that I didn't imagine it. But evidence of what? The therapist would say it's evidence of my brain's capacity for construction, for creating false memories so vivid they might as well be real. And perhaps she's right. Perhaps there's no meaningful difference. I brought the badge to work today. I don't know why. I keep touching it in my pocket, feeling the shape of it against my fingers, confirming it still exists. At lunch, I looked up the telephone number for the mill's corporate office again. Blake answered, "It's the same person each time," which seems unlikely, but I'm past the point of expecting likelihood to mean anything. "I called a few days ago," I said, "about the mill." "I don't recall," Blake said, "about the closed building. You said it was scheduled for demolition." "The mill," Blake said carefully, "has been operating a skeleton crew for the last 3 years. Minimal staffing. Mostly automated processes now." "Why are you asking about that?" The phone felt heavy in my hand. "You said it was closed." "I don't think I would have said that," Blake said. And then, with a strange inflection in his voice, almost clinical, almost pitying, "Where are you calling from right now?" I hung up. That was this morning. Since then, I haven't been able to focus. I keep checking the lock on my apartment door. The deadbolt is solid, the chain is secure, and then I keep checking again, because security feels like a concept rather than a reliable fact. My apartment is small, 2 rooms. I can confirm that both are empty. I can confirm that I'm alone. But in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I hear it. Not the punch clock, something quieter. The sound of a badge being inserted into a time slot. The mechanical whisper of data being recorded. The sound of a shift being marked as beginning or ending or occurring in that strange space between the two, the hours during which I am not aware of myself, during which my body continues its routines in a place that can't exist, shouldn't exist, and yet apparently never stopped waiting for me to return. The refrigerator in my kitchen has started humming in a rhythm that sounds almost like breathing. And on Tuesday morning, I'll wake up and I'll check my email, and there will be a new message sent from my account at a time when I was asleep. The mill is still patient. It's still waiting for my shift to end. Story 2. The Derelict Motel, where every room holds my suitcase unpacked. I've been driving past that motel for 12 years without stopping, and I'm not entirely sure why tonight was different. The Grandview sits 3 miles outside the county line on a stretch of road that most people have learned to skip. It's the kind of place that exists in the margins of travel, not quite empty enough to be forgotten, not quite maintained enough to be chosen. I'd seen it 100 times since I left, always in my peripheral vision, always with my eyes pointed forward. But last week, going through boxes in my basement, I found the receipt. Room 117, dated August 16th, 2012, and I realized I'd never actually checked out. The drive there took longer than I expected. The road had narrowed in my memory. It seemed shorter when I was 23, when every highway felt temporary. Now it stretched, winding through stands of pine where the sunlight had already begun its early autumn retreat. The sky was a peculiar shade of gray-blue, the kind that makes you feel watched by something patient. The motel announced itself gradually. First, the faded paint of the old billboard, its letters weathered to ghost impressions. Then the outline of the structure itself, emerging from behind a rise, 2 stories of cream-colored brick arranged in that tired horseshoe shape, facing inward toward what had once been a pool. The pool was still there. I could see the cracked and rust-stained basin from the road, empty and deep, like a wound that had stopped bleeding but never closed. It was 6:20 in the evening. The sun was sinking faster than it should have been. I pulled into the lot and parked near the office, engine still running while I sat there and looked at the place. 12 years. The last time I'd been here, I'd been someone else entirely. Someone who thought 3 nights in a motel room was enough time to change direction. I'd come alone, with a suitcase and a plan that I'd decided against within 48 hours. I'd driven away without bothering to return the key, without settling the bill, without doing any of the ordinary things you do when you leave a place. I'd been running from something small and personal, the way you do when you're young and believe the world is negotiable. The office door stuck when I pushed it, not locked, stuck, as if the frame had settled and wouldn't quite let the wood swing freely. The interior smelled like stale coffee, and the particular mustiness of spaces where air doesn't move freely. Behind the counter was a man I didn't recognize. He was older, maybe 60, with the kind of face that suggested he'd been somewhere else entirely until very recently. "Help you?" he asked, not looking up from a ledger that he'd suddenly become very interested in. "I'm Morgan," I said. "I stayed here a long time ago, room 117. I stopped, not sure what I'd wanted." "Apologize?" "Understand?" "I wanted to check on something." The man's eyes moved to me, and I watched them go blank in a practiced, professional way. The way someone's expression goes when they're deciding whether you're worth remembering. Room 117's occupied, he said. We've got 203 and 214 available. No, I said. I'm not looking for a room. I used to stay here 12 years ago. I wondered if you had any records from 2012? His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. We don't keep records that far back. It was a strange thing to say. Not a hotel manager's response. A hotel manager would have checked. A hotel manager would have been curious about an unpaid bill, about an unreturned key. This man had answered as if I'd asked him about something he was specifically not supposed to discuss. Right, I said. Of course. Rooms start at $60, he continued, returning his attention to the ledger. Cash or card. Checkout's 11. I left the office and didn't correct him. I didn't tell him I wasn't staying. Something in the quality of his disinterest suggested that telling him wouldn't change anything anyway. The motel's corridors wrapped around the empty pool like arms around a secret. I walked the upper level first, past doors painted in shades of rust and cream, past windows that were boarded or curtained or so layered with grime that you couldn't see anything beyond them. The afternoon light was thin here, filtered through the overhanging structure, making everything look like it existed underwater. Room 117 was where I remembered it, near the far end of the horseshoe, on the ground level, facing the pool. The door was an institutional brown, the number mounted in tarnished brass. I tried the handle without any real expectation that it would open. It did. It opened as easily as if I'd never left. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Exactly, the bed was unmade, sheets twisted in the way they'd been twisted when I'd woken that last morning and decided that whatever I'd come here to do, I couldn't do it. The small television sat on its stand, silent and dark. The bathroom door was half open, and I could see the edge of a towel hanging from the rack, pale and faded. But it was the suitcase that stopped me. It sat at the foot of the bed, navy blue, with a broken zipper that I'd never bothered to repair. My suitcase, the one I'd left behind. It was packed, latched, waiting as if I'd stepped out for a moment and hadn't yet come back. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I moved. There was no rational explanation for why it hadn't been disposed of, why it hadn't been claimed, why it was simply sitting there as if time hadn't passed. The motel was operational. Someone came through these rooms. Someone cleaned or didn't clean. Someone would have found an abandoned suitcase and dealt with it in whatever way motels deal with such things. But here it was, intact, undisturbed, waiting for me. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, and the suitcase sat there at my feet like a question I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. The light in the room was fading. Through the small window at the far wall, the empty pool had begun to look less like concrete and more like shadow. I found myself standing, moving down the corridor without consciously deciding to, drawn by something I couldn't name. The next room down, 118, had its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. It was darker than 117, curtains drawn against the last of the evening light, but I could see the outline of a bed and on that bed, another suitcase. The same suitcase, navy blue, broken zipper. My breath came differently then. Shallower, I moved to the next room, 119. The door was unlocked. Same suitcase, same position, same terrible, patient waiting. I stopped checking after the fifth one. I stood in the corridor, back pressed against the cool brick, and tried to think of something sensible to tell myself about what I was looking at. Some explanation that didn't involve the word impossible. Some rational framing that accounted for one suitcase found and returned by a conscientious manager, or stored by a property owner, or placed by someone who wanted what? To prove something? To demonstrate that I'd never really left? The windows of the motel, the ones facing inward toward the pool, began to light up as dusk settled into something darker. Not all of them, just scattered ones, on both levels, arranged with the randomness of rooms that people actually occupied. Each lit window, when I finally made myself look, held the same view. A suitcase, navy blue, waiting on a bed. Waiting for someone who'd never come back to get it. Waiting for someone who was, perhaps, still here somewhere. Still checking in, still unpacking, still deciding that leaving was harder than staying. I was still in the corridor when the manager appeared at the far end, silhouetted in the doorway of the office. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at something beyond the motel, beyond the lot, toward the highway I'd driven in on. His expression was neutral. His posture was still. I realized he was waiting for something, the way you wait for someone to come back. The weight of the place settled on my shoulders then, not suddenly, but gradually, like something had been pressing down on me the entire time I'd been here, and I'd only just now become aware of the pressure. The motel wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned or half forgotten or slowly dying. It was full. It was absolutely full of people who'd arrived and never managed the leaving part. People whose rooms still held the things they'd brought with them. People who existed in those lit windows, in those shadowed corridors, in that impossible patient gathering around an empty pool. And somewhere in this structure, in one of these rooms, with the television dark and the sheets unmade, was the person I'd been 12 years ago. The person who'd checked in and then checked out of everything that came after. The person who'd never actually driven away at all. The office door closed without anyone pushing it. I watched the space where the manager had been standing, waiting for him to reappear, but the doorway remained empty. The glass door to the office reflected only the corridor behind me. Empty, too, stretching toward the front entrance I'd come through what felt like hours ago but couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. The clock above the front desk read 7:43. It had read 7:23 when I first walked in. I was still holding my own suitcase. The handle had begun to cut off circulation in my fingers. I set it down carefully on the concrete as if sudden movement might trigger something I couldn't take back. The motel hummed around me, not with activity but with presence, the ambient sound of a place with all its systems running, all its mechanisms engaged. The ice machine in the far corridor cycled through something that sounded almost like speech. The pool pump down in the courtyard below maintained a steady breathing rhythm. And underneath it all, something else. A frequency at the edge of hearing. The kind of sound you feel in your teeth rather than your ears. I moved toward the stairs. Not toward my original room, not yet, but toward the lit windows I'd seen from the corridor. The first one was on this level, just past the junction where the hallway turned. Room 127. The door looked identical to every other door, numbered in brass that had tarnished to a dull bronze, painted a shade of beige that had been chosen, I imagined, because it was impossible to judge as either clean or dirty. The door frame showed no signs of forced entry. The lock plate was undamaged. Whoever had left the light on had done so from the inside. I didn't knock. I didn't try the handle. Instead, I stood in front of the window and looked in. The suitcase sat exactly where I'd seen it from the courtyard, on the bed, the navy blue one, the same color as the one I was still dragging behind me, the same worn zipper pulls, the same faded label on the side. The bed was otherwise empty. No one sat on it. No one moved in the shadows beyond the bed. The curtains were drawn but thin enough that the bedside lamp illuminated the room in washed-out yellows and creams, and there was something else visible through the gap, a television in the corner, dark, reflecting nothing. I counted the doors between this room and where I remembered my own room being. 22 years ago, I'd paid for 3 nights. I'd requested a room away from the highway noise. The manager then, a different manager, a younger man with tired eyes and a wedding ring he kept twisting, had handed me a key attached to a diamond-shaped piece of plastic, room 156. Second floor, east wing, far end, facing the woods. I turned away from room 127 and headed for the stairs. The carpeting on the second floor was in marginally better condition than downstairs, though the pattern had worn away in a distinct path that suggested regular foot traffic. That shouldn't have been possible. The motel was empty. The motel was closed. I was certain of this, or I had been certain, before the contradictions had begun accumulating like the dust on the room number plaques. Room 156 was where I remembered it being. The door was closed. The window beside it was dark. I didn't want to look inside. The wanting not to had a physical weight to it, a pressure behind my sternum that made each breath require conscious effort. I looked anyway. The room was empty, completely empty. Not just unoccupied, but stripped, no furniture, no fixtures, not even curtain rods. The walls were bare and water-stained. The carpet had been removed, leaving only the concrete subflooring, which showed darker patches where moisture had accumulated over years. It was a gutted space, abandoned mid-renovation or left to decay after abandonment began. It was the room I should have expected to find. It wasn't the room I'd actually expected. I turned away and walked further down the corridor, past the next few doors, until I found another lit window. Room 159. Inside, another suitcase, another bed, another dark television. This one was black, the suitcase, and the bed was unmade in a way that suggested someone had pulled back the covers and then left them that way, as if they might return at any moment to resume what they'd been doing. My phone had no signal. I'd known this since arriving, the dead band of Wi-Fi, less space that seemed to exist around the motel like a natural exclusion zone. But I checked again anyway, a compulsive gesture, the way you might repeatedly check that a door was locked. No bars, no connection available. Even the time display seemed stuck. Or perhaps I'd simply stopped looking at it long enough to notice it hadn't changed. The manager's voice, when it came from below. You look like someone who's staying. I went to the railing and looked down into the courtyard. He was standing by the pool now, looking up at me with the same neutral expression he'd worn in the office. The water in the pool was perfectly still, the surface like black glass, reflecting the lights that lined its perimeter, lights that I definitely had not been on during my first circuit of the property. "I'm not," I said. "You took a room. I'm deciding. You've been deciding for a long time." He said it as observation, not accusation. "You came in at 7:05. You checked in. The room key is in your pocket. You have luggage. The steps you're taking through the halls, they're the steps of someone who's starting to settle. Reconnoiter. That's what we call it when guests need to establish the geography of where they're going to be staying." I wanted to correct him. I wanted to say that I'd never checked in, that I'd never been given a key, that the entire transaction existed only in his mind or in some gap in my own memory that was widening by the minute. But my hand was already moving to my pocket, and my fingers were already closing around something metal and diamond-shaped that hadn't been there before. "I'm not staying," I said, but I was looking at the key in my hand, room 147. The number was stamped in the same faded print as every other room number in this building. Everyone says that at first. He looked away from me, toward the highway beyond the motel's perimeter. Still waiting. Still patient. Everyone thinks they can come in, sort through their belongings, solve the problem of what they brought with them, and leave. But you don't really leave a motel. You just move deeper into it. The ice machine cycled again. This time it sounded exactly like someone calling a name. The same name repeated over and over, too distorted by mechanical noise to be intelligible, but human in intent, in the shape of wanting to be heard. I went to room 147. It was on this same floor, one corridor over, facing the woods that had grown up around the property's eastern edge. The woods were dense, black now in the fading light, pressing against the motel like something patient and inevitable. The window was lit. Inside, on the bed, was a suitcase, navy blue, the same color as my own, the same size, the same faded label. But the suitcase was open. Inside it, neatly folded and stacked with obsessive precision, were clothes I recognized. Jeans I'd worn in 2003. A sweater I'd loved before the elbows wore through. A shirt with a stain on the sleeve that I'd been meaning to treat before I'd checked in here on a day that had seemed like an ordinary day, but had somehow, across 2 decades, become the day everything stopped. There was also a notebook. It lay on top of the clothes, and its pages were filled with handwriting I didn't recognize immediately. Loose, wandering script that seemed to circle the same sentences over and over. Variations on a single desperate question. How long have I been here? How long have I been here? How long have I been here? The first entry I could read clearly was dated 3 days after I'd arrived. The second entry was dated 6 months later. The third was dated 2 years later. There were others in between, scattered across pages, growing more sparse as the years accumulated. The last entry was dated from last month. It read, "Someone new is coming. I can feel it. Someone who remembers what it was like to drive away. Someone who might remember how." I didn't go into the room. I didn't touch the suitcase or the notebook or any of the things inside. Instead, I backed away from the window and stood in the corridor, breathing in the recycled air that had begun to smell like something I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, not dust, but something like the lingering ghost scent of every person who'd ever stayed here, layered one on top of another until they'd become a single, unmemorable smell. The olfactory equivalent of white noise. My feet carried me back to the stairs. Not down, but up. There was a third floor. I'd noticed it from the exterior before I'd entered the building. A low roof line with fewer windows. I'd assumed it was some kind of administrative space, maybe a few additional rooms. It seemed important, suddenly, to know what was up there. To understand the structure of the place I was beginning to suspect wasn't a structure at all, but something else. Something larger and more patient than any building made of concrete and drywall should be. The stairwell on the third floor was narrower. The lighting was worse. The air was colder. And every single door I passed, and I passed many, had its light on. Every single window showed the same scene. A suitcase, a bed, the patient accumulation of things someone had brought here and then left behind. At the far end of the corridor, one door was open. The room inside was identical to room 147. With one crucial difference, the bed was occupied. A figure lay on top of the blankets, fully clothed, facing the wall. The suitcase on the dresser was empty. Clothes scattered across the surrounding surfaces as if someone had been searching through them repeatedly, looking for something that was no longer there. On the nightstand beside the figure, a glass of water sat undisturbed, a thin film of dust on its surface. I couldn't see the person's face. I didn't need to. I already knew that it was me. Below, the manager called out again, "Your room is ready whenever you are." I don't remember walking back downstairs. I remember the stairwell narrowing around me, the walls pressing closer with each descent. And then I was in the lobby, and the manager was standing behind the desk with that same patient smile, the fluorescent light turning his skin the color of old paper. "Your room is ready whenever you are," he said again, though I'd never left the lobby. Or had I? The certainty that I'd been upstairs, that I'd seen what I'd seen, was already beginning to feel like something I'd read about rather than experienced. Like a memory of a dream, thin and frameless, losing coherence the moment I tried to hold it. "I need to leave," I said. The words came out as a question. "Of course," the manager said. "Everyone needs to leave eventually. That's the hardest part to understand at first, the wanting to leave. Most people get past that pretty quickly." I moved toward the entrance. The glass doors that had seemed so substantial when I'd arrived now looked transparent in a way that made me uncomfortable, like they might not actually be there at all. I pushed against one. It opened. The parking lot was the same as it had been when I'd driven in. Same empty asphalt. Same quality of sunlight that didn't quite touch anything. Same sense of being in a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. My car was still there. I could see it clearly, the familiar dent in the passenger door, the slight rust creeping up from the wheel wells. I walked toward it. The distance seemed to change as I moved, the car receding slightly with each step forward, though my feet told me I was walking in a straight line. When I finally reached it, the door handle was warm, and I realized that the engine was running, had been running the entire time. The fuel gauge showed that I had enough gas to reach the highway. Past that, I had no way of knowing. The keys were in my pocket. I hadn't remembered putting them there, but they were there. I got in the car. I put it in reverse. I backed away from the motel, watching the building shrink in my mirror, the manager still standing in the lobby, watching me go. The moment I'd backed far enough to see the full parking lot, I saw them, the other cars. They'd been there all along, of course. Dozens of them, lined up in perfect rows, all facing the motel, all with their engines running. I pressed the accelerator. The car gained speed. I turned onto the access road, and the motel disappeared behind a stand of trees that I didn't remember being there. When I looked in my mirror again, expecting to see it vanish into the distance, I saw instead that the trees had opened up behind me onto the motel's parking lot. The building was still there, still the same distance away, still watching. I drove faster. The road curved and twisted, but every time I checked the mirror, the motel remained equidistant, as if I were on a treadmill that matched my speed exactly. The trees on either side of the road became denser, older, their trunks wider than cars, their branches so thickly interwoven that the daylight filtered through them in a sickly green haze. And still, whenever I looked back, the motel was there. After what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour, the fuel gauge hadn't moved, which I tried very hard not to notice. The road widened. A sign appeared through the windshield, and for a moment my heart lifted because it was a real sign, a legitimate road marker with actual numbers and directions. Then I read what it said. Welcome back. Room 147 awaits. The numbering beneath it wasn't a distance, it was a room number. I slammed on the brakes. The car stopped perfectly without skid marks, as if I'd simply paused mid-thought. In the silence that followed, I became aware of something I'd been subconsciously hearing since I'd gotten in the car. The sound of pen on paper, rhythmic and desperate, coming from the back seat. I didn't turn around. Instead, I looked in the rearview mirror. A figure sat in the back seat, hunched over a notebook, writing frantically. The script was the same loose, wandering handwriting I'd seen in the room on the 3rd floor. The figure wrote the same sentence over and over. So quickly the pen seemed to blur. How long have I been here? How long have I been here? How long have I been here? The figure's head came up. In the mirror I saw my own face looking back at me, but older, hollowed out, with eyes that contained the accumulated weight of every version of myself that had ever sat in this car, on this road, trying to escape. You made it further than most, the other me said. Its voice was my voice, but layered, as if spoken through water. 6 miles. That's good. Most people don't get past the parking lot. They just sit in their cars and realize that the mileage will never change. The fuel gauge will never drop, and they back up and go back to the motel, because at least the motel has beds and water that hasn't turned to dust yet. This isn't real, I said. Neither were the first 3 days, it replied. But here you are, on day 2 decades plus 1. You're still driving toward the highway. You're still going to reach it. And when you do, you're going to find that your house is still there. Your job is still waiting, and the date on your calendar is still the day you checked in. I pressed the accelerator again. The car moved forward. In the mirror, my older self returned to its notebook, pen scratching against paper in that same desperate rhythm. The sound followed me as I drove, through the green-filtered forest, past landmarks that seemed both entirely new and strangely familiar, toward a horizon that stayed precisely the same distance away, no matter how hard I pushed the car to move. The fuel gauge never dropped. The motel never quite disappeared, even when I couldn't see it. I could feel its presence behind me, patient and inevitable like gravity. And somewhere in the back seat, I was still writing, asking the only question that mattered, the only question that had ever mattered. How long have I been here? The answer I was beginning to understand was not a measure of time at all. It was a measure of when I stopped trying to leave. I stopped driving around mile 12. The realization came not as a sudden clarity, but as a gradual erosion of purpose, like a stone worn smooth by water that never actually touches it. I understood, without needing to test it further, that the road would continue exactly as it had been continuing. The fuel gauge would remain half full. The forest would cycle through its careful repetitions of birdsong and rustling undergrowth, and in the back seat, my other self would continue writing its diminishing spirals of the same question, the pen moving slower now, more deliberate, as if conserving energy for something that might take a very long time. I turned the car around. The motel appeared almost exactly as I remembered it, though I couldn't say with certainty that I'd traveled back to it, or that it had somehow contracted toward me during my drive. The distinction seemed less important now. The parking lot still held its strange emptiness. The office light still burned behind drawn curtains. The pool still reflected nothing in particular. I parked in the same space. I don't know why I thought that mattered. When I went inside, the clerk at the desk looked up from his ledger, with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting me all along. His face was unremarkable in a way that made it difficult to hold the details in memory, brown eyes perhaps, or gray, or some indeterminate shade that your mind refused to organize into a coherent image. He didn't speak. He simply turned the register around and gestured toward the key rack behind him, where room 147 still hung exactly where it had been before. I took the key. The weight of it in my palm felt like significance, though I couldn't articulate what significance might mean in this context. The room was exactly as I'd left it. The suitcase remained open on the bed, clothes unfolded, toiletries arranged with that strange precision that suggested someone had gone through them while looking for something specific. The window still faced the parking lot. The air still held that peculiar staleness, that sense of a space that has never been quite alive. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the understanding to complete itself. It came in pieces. Not as a narrative, no dramatic revelation about what the place was or how it functioned, but as a simple, aching knowledge that something had shifted in me during those miles. The panic was gone. The desperation was gone. Even the certainty that I needed to leave had been worn away by repetition, by the futility of motion that generated no distance. I lay back on the bed, still wearing my clothes, still wearing my shoes, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Sleep came easily. It was the first easy thing I'd experienced since the moment I'd first read that road sign. I didn't dream, or if I did, the dreams left no impression, like footprints in sand just before the tide comes in. When I woke, the light outside the window suggested early morning, though it might have been late afternoon filtered through something opaque I couldn't name. I got up and showered. The water ran hot. It stayed hot. It didn't turn to dust. These small facts seemed important. I dressed in clean clothes from the suitcase, and the act of selecting a shirt and pants felt almost normal. The kind of ordinary decision I might have made in some other life, in some place where linear time still meant something. The next morning, I went to the diner. The waitress recognized me, or else recognized something about me. A quality of being, perhaps, rather than a specific face. She poured coffee without asking and brought toast with butter that hadn't yet begun to separate. The coffee was warm and competent. Nothing more, nothing less. There were other people in the diner. They blurred together in my memory, and they didn't look at me, but I couldn't determine whether this was because they didn't see me or because they saw exactly what I was and had decided, long ago, that eye contact wasn't worth the effort. I spent the afternoon in my room. I didn't try to leave. I didn't check the fuel gauge. I didn't get in the car. I sat by the window and watched the light change in ways that suggested time was still passing, even if it wasn't carrying me anywhere. That night, I heard something in the back seat of my car. I knew this without having been near the car, the way you know certain things in dreams without having been told them. My other self was still there, still writing, but the handwriting had changed. It was slower now, more deliberate. The sentence had shifted. Instead of, "How long have I been here?" the pen moved in patterns that formed something different. This is not the worst thing that could happen. I never went to check. I didn't need to. The knowledge was already lodged somewhere deep, in a part of my mind that had accepted certain parameters and was no longer interested in challenging them. Days accumulated. I lost count. The motel didn't change. I took meals in the diner. The waitress continued to pour coffee without asking. The other guests continued their quiet, unremarkable existence, moving through the space like ghosts who had long ago stopped wondering whether they were really present. My room remained room 147. My key remained the same weight in my pocket. The suitcase slowly transformed from a symbol of transit to simply a piece of furniture. A place where I kept my clothes. There was a television in the room. I never turned it on. There was a phone. I never used it. There were books on the nightstand, their pages foxed and soft with age, but I couldn't focus on their narratives. They seemed to be about people who lived in places where the future was still a meaningful concept. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit at the small desk and consider writing in a notebook. Not the question, something else. A description of the color of the carpet, an observation about the way light fell through the window, a simple fact about being alive in a place that no longer required me to move. But I would always stop before the pen touched paper. I understood, without needing to test it, that if the derelict motel where every room holds my suitcase unpacked additional middle section the hallway stretched longer than any hallway should. I'd walked it 3 times now, counting doorways, 16 on the left, 17 on the right. And each time the perspective seemed to lengthen ahead of me, as if the corridor was breathing, expanding with each breath I took. The carpet beneath my feet was the color of old tea stains, a beige so muted it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I looked down at my footprints, I could see the pattern they left in the dust. A thin film had settled over everything, undisturbed except for those paths. My paths, none others. The air tasted like it looked. That's the only way I can describe it. Stale, yes, but with something beneath the staleness, a mineral quality, like licking concrete, like breathing in a place that had been sealed away from freshness for so long that the very molecules had turned brittle and exhausted. It caught in my throat. I found myself breathing through my mouth, which was worse, because then I tasted it instead of just smelling it. Room 127 was directly to my left. I could feel it the way you feel someone watching you. I stopped, though I hadn't meant to. My hand rose to the brass plate beside the door. The numbers had gone green with age, that soft oxidized green of things abandoned to weather and time. The number 8 was backward, or I was reading it wrong. Everything felt slightly wrong here, slightly tilted, as though I was looking at the world through glass that wasn't quite level. The door was painted a shade I could only describe as the color of a bruise healing. Not purple, not blue, but that sickly greenish tone that comes after the swelling goes down. The paint was peeling in long, vertical strips, curling away from the wood beneath like dead skin. I could see the layers, white paint underneath, then yellow, then another white. Each one a different era, a different person's idea of what this room should look like. I wondered about them, the people who had painted these doors. How many decades back did that go? How long had this place been refusing to welcome anyone? I didn't touch the door. I had learned not to. The window beside room 127 was dark in a way that windows shouldn't be dark. There's a difference between a room being dark because it's night and a room being dark because light itself has given up on entering it. This was the latter. I could see the reflection of the hallway in the glass, my own figure, indistinct and gray, hovering in the middle distance like something that had partially faded. When I moved, my reflection didn't quite move with me. It lagged, just a fraction of a second behind. I kept walking. The carpet had changed texture under my feet. In some places it was soft, almost plush, and in others it was brittle, the fibers crunching slightly with each step. I could feel the difference even through my shoes, the firmness of the foundation beneath, or the hollowness where water had rotted through the subflooring long ago. The smell changed with it. Where the carpet was soft, the air smelled of mildew and that old fabric smell, like breathing in a closet that had been closed too long. Where it was brittle, the smell was drier, almost chemical, insulation, drywall dust, whatever toxins had been sealed in these walls since before I was born. The light fixtures overhead were recessed, set into a suspended ceiling that had gone yellow and brown with age. Some of the tiles were missing, revealing the darkness above, a crawl space or attic, I guessed, though I couldn't see far enough to know for certain. The ones that remained had water stains spreading across them like continents on a map of somewhere forgotten. A few lights still worked. Not all of them, and never consistently. As I walked, I would pass under one that buzzed quietly, then another that had gone dark, then another that flickered with what seemed like hesitation, as though it was remembering how to turn on. One of the lights had something inside it. I realized this as I was directly beneath it. There was something in the fixture, behind the frosted plastic diffuser. A shape. A suggestion of mass. I didn't stop. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the horizon of the hallway ahead and felt the back of my neck tighten with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The temperature in the hallway was genuinely cold, though I could see my breath if I paid attention, thin clouds of white that appeared and dissipated. The air conditioning, if it had ever worked, was long since broken. This cold was coming from somewhere else. I thought, without wanting to think it, of basements, of earth, of things beneath that might bleed upward through concrete and copper pipes. Room 134, room 135. The numbers became abstract to me after a while, just shapes on metal plates. But I knew them. I remembered them. I had walked this hallway in the dark, running my hand along the wall, feeling for the doorways, and I had memorized the spacing of them. I knew that there was a longer gap between 139 and 140. I knew that the wall to the right became rougher around 142, as though something had scraped against it repeatedly over time. I found myself standing in front of the ice machine. I hadn't meant to come this way. I had been heading in the opposite direction. But here I was, facing the white metal cabinet with its coin slots and its chute, and I had no clear memory of turning around or retracing my steps. The machine was humming. Not the sound of ice being made, but the low, constant hum of a refrigerant still cycling through tubes, still using electricity that someone, somewhere, was still paying for. The power was still on. How was the power still on? The coin slots had a dull gleam to them, as though someone had wiped them clean very recently. The chute was dark, and when I leaned closer, I couldn't help myself. I could see a faint light reflecting off something inside. Ice, maybe, or glass. The smell coming from it was wrong. Not the clean chemical smell you'd expect from a working machine, but something organic, something that had spent a long time in cold storage and had started to ferment. I moved away from it. The hallway opened into what had once been a gathering space. A lounge, probably, There was still furniture arranged in it, though the arrangement had nothing to do with comfort. The pieces seemed to have been pushed over time into configurations that made no sense. A chair faced the corner. A sofa was angled toward a wall. There was a television mounted high on the wall, its screen dark and reflecting nothing, and beneath it a small table held a stack of magazines in such a neat, deliberate pile that I knew no random wind had stacked them that way. Someone had done it. Someone had been here, arranging things. The magazines were dated. I could read the dates without picking them up, without touching them. 2 years old. 3 years. The topmost one was so faded that the cover image had nearly vanished, leaving only a ghostly outline of something that might have been a woman's face, or might have been a landscape, or might have been nothing at all. One of the curtains over the lounge windows was half drawn, not the way you draw a curtain, not smoothly, not all the way, just draped, as though someone had reached for it and then stopped, leaving their gesture incomplete. The fabric was heavy, densely woven, and had faded to the color of fog. Through the opening, I could see the parking lot. It was empty except for my car, which seemed impossibly far away, impossibly small. The pavement around it was cracked, weeds growing through the fissures in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language I didn't know. The television drew my eye. I kept looking away from it and then looking back. There was something about it that felt present, that demanded attention. It was a flat screen, relatively modern by the standards of this place. An incongruity. Who had installed it? When? Who had thought it important enough to keep that working while everything else decayed around it? I realized I was approaching it. My feet were moving without my conscious permission. I stopped them. I forced myself to turn away and walk back toward the hallway, and as I did I heard something from the television. Not sound, exactly, a vibration, a frequency just at the edge of hearing. The sound you feel in your motors before you hear it with your ears. The hallway was no longer the hallway I had left. Or perhaps I had never truly left it. The perspective was different. The way the walls converged in the distance seemed sharper, more pronounced. The darkness at the far end seemed closer, though I could measure the distance and know that it hadn't moved. The doors on either side were more densely packed than I remembered. They seemed to overlap slightly, as though the hallway was trying to hold too many of them in the same space. I began counting the doors again. I was on my 5th pass at this, I realized. I had lost track of which direction I had been going. The numbers on the plates were no longer aligned in logical order. I saw room 156, then 123, then 178. A door had no number at all, just a blank brass plate and a lock that looked newer than anything else in this place. Recent, someone had replaced it. The floor beneath my feet had developed a give. Not rotting, exactly. More like there was something beneath the floor. An empty space. A void. With each step I felt the subflooring flex slightly, and I imagined the gap below me. The distance between the floor and whatever was beneath it. How deep did it go? Was there foundation down there, or was there just emptiness? Just the dark earth that this building sat upon, slowly reclaiming its space. I sat down. I found a spot on the floor and I sat on it, my back against the wall. and I tried to breathe steadily. The wall was cold. I could feel it through my jacket, through my shirt, against my skin. It was the kind of cold that doesn't seem to be radiating from anywhere specific. The wall itself had become cold, or I had become something that experienced coldness more acutely in this place. Time did something strange. I had been sitting for what felt like minutes, but when I checked my phone, an hour had passed. Then I checked again, and it was the same time. The phone was telling me it was 3:47 a.m., but it wouldn't move past that. I put it away. The hallway was full of sounds that I hadn't noticed before because I had been moving, had been focused on the mechanical act of walking. Now, sitting still, I could hear them. The hum of the ice machine, distant and rhythmic, the whisper of air moving through vents, or perhaps just the building settling, adjusting itself. A dripping sound from somewhere, water falling at irregular intervals, not quite a rhythm, but not entirely random either. Something in the walls, movement, no, not movement, just the sound of things moving. Pipes, settling, the sound of time passing in a place where time had forgotten to move. And beneath all of it, a sound that I couldn't quite identify. Almost like breathing, almost like something very far away calling, a sound that made the back of my neck cold in a way that the cold wall against my back did not. I stood up. I needed to move. Movement was the only thing that kept the sound at a distance. The carpet beneath my feet was now a different color entirely. I was certain of this, though I couldn't say how it had changed. It was darker now, with a red tone to it, like old blood. I didn't want to think that way, but the color suggested it. When I looked behind me, the carpet showed my footprints very clearly, darker still, as though my weight had compressed the color out of it, revealing something underneath. The doors seemed closer together now. I was moving past them faster, or they were moving past me. The brass plates were unreadable, the numbers worn smooth and indistinct. I could feel the room's presence like weight on either side of me. Each door was closed. Each one was shut against the hallway, against the open space where I walked. Behind each one something, a suitcase unpacked. Clothes distributed across the furniture, the ghost of someone's beginning of a stay that had never progressed to the rest. The hallway ended ahead of me. Or it turned. I couldn't tell which until I was nearly there. And then I saw that it turned left, and the turn itself seemed to bend reality slightly. The wall on the corner seemed to be more than one surface, as though if I touched it, I would feel depth that shouldn't exist. The angle was too acute. The geometry was wrong. I didn't take the turn. I stopped, and I looked at the wall, and I placed my hand on it, and it was ice. I began to write. I might write forever, and that the distinction between writing and being written might eventually collapse into something indistinguishable. Once, I thought I saw someone who looked like me. Not the older version from the car, but someone closer to who I'd been before arriving. They were walking through the parking lot, pulling a suitcase, looking at the motel with an expression of dawning dread that I recognized absolutely. I watched from my window as they approached the office. I watched as they emerged with a key. I considered going downstairs to warn them, to explain what the place was, to prepare them for the particular kind of endlessness that awaited. But I didn't go downstairs. I understood at some level deeper than conscious thought that warnings were a form of motion, and motion was something I had finally learned to stop investing in. Instead, I turned away from the window and waited to hear which room they'd been assigned. It was room 149. I heard them moving around in there for several days, the sound of unpacking, the shower running at irregular hours, the television playing programs I couldn't quite make out. Then, gradually, the sound stopped. They had either accepted the place, as I had, or found some other way to exist within it. I didn't think about them very often after that. The thing that lingered, the thing that refused to leave, was something small. It was the moment before action, stretched and made infinite. It was the hesitation at the threshold, preserved under glass. It was the understanding that I had been given, in the form of a motel and a key and an endlessly patient room, a kind of grace. Not the grace of escape, but the grace of permission to stop trying. Sometimes I would reach for the car keys, and my hand would hover there, suspended between intention and execution. And I would feel that other me in the back seat, pen still moving, still writing, still asking questions that the motel had long ago decided not to answer. And I would let my hand fall away, and I would sit back down, and I would wait for the coffee to be poured, for the light to change, for the next small measure of time to accumulate into something that resembled a life. The fuel gauge in my car still never moved. I knew this without needing to check, and some nights I would lie in bed and listen to the pen scratching against paper in the back seat, and I would realize that the voice writing wasn't necessarily asking anything anymore. It was simply testifying to the fact of being here, to the accumulated weight of every moment that had failed to carry me away, to the terrible quiet knowledge that some places don't let you leave, because leaving has already become impossible, not through force, but through the slow, gentle erosion of the desire to be anywhere else. The pen would scratch and scratch and scratch, and eventually I would fall asleep to the sound of it, as if it were the most natural rhythm in the world. Story 3. The overgrown subdivision where one house has all my furniture inside. The road in isn't paved anymore. I noticed this first, not the silence, not the overturned mailboxes, or the way the trees have bent themselves across what used to be Hickory Lane. It's the texture. My tires find gravel beneath asphalt that's been broken and lifted by 30 years of roots, and the sound of it fills the car like something I've swallowed whole. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The rhythm of going backward in time, one small stone at a time. I haven't been back here since I was 12. My hands are tighter on the wheel than they need to be. The subdivision was called Clearwater Heights, though there was no water anywhere near it, and the highest point in the neighborhood was Mrs. Hendrick's roof. We lived here in 1994, maybe 1995. My parents bought the house during a mortgage boom no one understood, sold it during whatever collapse came after, and we moved 3 states away in the back of a Suburban with all our things wrapped in blankets. I haven't thought about these streets in a serious way since high school. Not until my sister sent me an article 3 months ago, something about abandoned suburbs, about how some of them don't get demolished so much as they're slowly eaten. She'd included satellite imagery of Clearwater Heights. The photos looked like they'd been taken of something in the process of digestion. You should see it in person, she'd written, before it's completely gone. I didn't know why I'd agreed. I didn't know why I'd scheduled it, driven 6 hours on a Friday, or pulled off Route 9 onto the old entrance road where a sign that once read Welcome to Clearwater Heights, a community, now reads Welcome to Clear, with the rest claimed by weather and climbing ivy. The houses start appearing through the trees about a quarter-mile in, not all at once. One at first, half buried in overgrowth, its windows like blind eyes. Then another. Then the whole neighborhood materializes around me in stages, the way something emerges from water. They are, almost all of them, destroyed in the slow way that nature does destruction. Not suddenly, not violently, just worn down steadily by moisture and organisms and the weight of seasons pressing inward. Vinyl siding has turned the color of wet bone. Gutters hang like broken jaws. There are trees growing through roofs, actual adult trees, 10 or 15 feet tall, their trunks thick as fence posts, splitting shingles like they're breaking through skin. One house on my right has a maple so large that the entire second story has collapsed around it. The maple doesn't seem bothered. The quiet is immense. That's what hits me second, after the roads. There are no sounds in Clearwater Heights except for my car, except for birds that don't call, except for the ambient whisper of leaves moving in wind I can't feel. No hum of electricity, no distant highway noise, no sense of anything alive except plants and sky and the slow, patient work of decay. I drive slowly. My hands have gone numb. I recognize the street names from memory, though the signs are tilted or missing. Clearwater Drive, Hickory Lane, Birch Court, where Alex lived in the yellow house with the plastic fence. The yellow house is gray now, and the fence is a suggestion. A few white planks leaning at angles like broken teeth. The neighborhood spreads out in a logic I remember. 4 streets in a rough square, with a cul-de-sac at the heart. We lived on Elm Ridge Road, the quietest of the 4 streets, the one that curved slightly toward the woods. My house was number 317. It was blue. A nice blue, my mother said, like water, though there was no water here. I turn on to Elm Ridge. The street is barely distinguishable from the terrain around it now. Nature hasn't just reclaimed it, nature is reclaiming it, actively right now. The asphalt buckles and cracks, weeds grow in thick mats. The sidewalks, once clean concrete, are now a patchwork of organic growth and disintegration. I'm driving very slowly, maybe 10 miles an hour, maybe less. The houses on Elm Ridge are gone in the way houses get gone when no one stops them from being taken. I can see into the ones I pass. Front doors hang open. Interiors are dark. The shapes of furniture linger in some of them. A couch slumped against a far wall, a cabinet with no doors. One house has a kitchen table still set for 4, though rain has come through the ceiling and the dishes have turned the color of ash. I'm looking for number 317, counting as I move. 309, 311, 313, 315, and then I stop. The house at 317 Elm Ridge is maintained. That's the only word for it. Maintained, there's no other house like it on the entire street, or in the visible portions of the neighborhood. The lawn around it has been cleared not recently, maybe, but clearly, deliberately, over an extended period. The grass is overgrown but not wild. The foundation is intact. The siding, though weathered, shows no major damage. The roof is whole. The shutters, blue I think, though it's hard to tell, are drawn. There are curtains in the windows, which is the strangest part. Actual curtains, beige ones, drawn completely closed. It's my house. I know this not because I recognize it suddenly with a flood of nostalgia. The opposite. The recognition comes in pieces, fragments that don't add up correctly. The shape of the front porch, the way the driveway curves, the specific small oak tree that my father planted the year before we left, it's much larger now, but it's shaped in a way that tree is shaped, with a slight bend in the trunk. All the details accumulate into a certainty that sits very wrong in my stomach. I park the car at the curb in front of the house and sit with the engine off. The sound returns in stages. Wind, leaves, the settling sound of a car cooling. My own breathing, which I notice is shallow. I'm not afraid, exactly. I'm something else. I'm confused in a way that hasn't happened to me in years. Not the confused of not understanding something. The confused of understanding something that doesn't make sense. The house is lived in. That's the feeling I can't quite move past. Someone is maintaining this house in the middle of an abandoned subdivision. Someone has decided that while the entire neighborhood rots, this one house, my house, the place where I slept as a child, where I learned to read, where I sat at the kitchen table doing homework while my mother graded papers, should be kept from the rot. I get out of the car. The air is warm and carries the smell of wet earth and decomposition, the generalized smell of any forest, except this isn't a forest. This is a neighborhood pretending to become one. My shoes sink slightly in the grass as I walk toward the driveway. Each step forward feels like a decision I'm making and not making simultaneously. The driveway is empty. There are no cars parked here, no signs of recent arrival. But the maintenance continues to speak to habitation. The gutters, though dark with age, are intact. There are no obvious gaps in the siding. Someone has kept the trees at a distance. Someone continues to do this work. I stand at the end of the driveway and look at my old house. I'm aware, in an intellectual way, that this is strange. Aware that my heart has accelerated. Aware that the explanation for this, squatters, someone who bought the house and maintained it, some other reason I haven't thought of, should be obvious and probably is. The brain is good at generating explanations. The brain hates mysteries, but my brain is having trouble generating them today. I move closer. The porch is 3 steps up, small, with a railing I remember touching with my palm every afternoon after school. The wood is weathered but sound. The door is solid. The curtains in the front window are definitely drawn. No light comes from within, no sound either, no music, no voices, no indication of life except for the clear. Unmistakable evidence that this house has been cared for. I walk to the window beside the front door. I cup my hands around my eyes and press my face against the glass, trying to see through the curtains. The gap between the curtain panels is small, maybe an inch wide. In that gap, I can see shapes, dark shapes, furniture shapes. A chair, maybe. The outline of something large and rectangular against a back wall. It looks familiar. I pull back from the window. My pulse is making itself known in my throat now, a steady throb that I can feel clearly. I'm not afraid. I'm still not quite afraid. I'm something else. I'm a person standing in front of their childhood home, which appears to be occupied by a ghost of normal habitation, and I'm trying very hard to believe that there's an explanation I'm just not thinking of fast enough. The driveway extends along the right side of the house toward where the garage should be. I can see the garage. Its door is closed, painted the same blue as the shutters. No windows, no way to see inside. No indication of whether there's a car there or anything else. I move toward it. I don't decide to. My legs simply carry me. The grass whispers against my pants. A bird, I don't know what kind, sounds a single high note from somewhere in the canopy of trees that surrounds the property. The subdivision is quiet, but this house and its immediate grounds feel even quieter, as if they've absorbed the silence and are holding it. The garage door doesn't open when I pull the handle. It's locked or rusted shut. I try harder, and it doesn't move. I let go. My palm comes away with a rust smear that comes off on my jeans without any real pressure. I walk around the side of the house. The backyard opens up in a way I remember, too large, too exposed, bordered by the tree line that seems to be slowly moving inward. The grass is unmowed and thick. There's no fence anymore, or it's collapsed, which amounts to the same thing. The back door, I can see it now, facing out across the yard, is also closed. The windows on this side are also curtained. But there's something else. A shed, small and wooden, positioned about 30 feet from the back corner of the house. It's the kind of shed that might have stored lawn equipment once, and it's well maintained, too, in the way the house is. The wood is weathered, but the roof is intact. The door closes properly. There's a padlock on it, though it's not locked. The metal hasp hangs open, the lock hanging from only one side. I don't open it. I'm not sure why. Something about the closed but unlocked state of the shed feels deliberate in a way I don't want to understand. I look at the back of my house instead, trying to remember what the interior looked like in daylight, trying to reconcile the memory with the reality of these curtained windows and the clear evidence of habitation. Then I see it. It's through one of the back windows, the one I remember looking out of from the kitchen, just barely visible around the edge of the curtain, in the gap where the fabric hasn't been pulled completely closed. The shape of something blue, something large and rectangular, something with a specific structure that memory reaches out to grab. A desk. My old desk. The one I did homework at. The one that had a bookshelf attached to the back and a surface scarred with decades of pencil marks and stickers that wouldn't come off. It's in my house. Someone has my desk, or a desk identical to it, or something that looks exactly like it. In this house, behind these curtains, in the dark interior that I can't quite see into. I'm at the window now. I'm looking through the gap. I can see the outline of the desk clearly now, and there's something on top of it. A lamp, maybe? A shape that catches what little light penetrates the curtains from somewhere deeper in the room. The image is too unclear to register as much more than an impression, but the impression is very strong. That's my desk. That's my lamp. That's the exact configuration of objects that sat on the desk in the room I slept in. I pull back from the window. My breathing has changed. It's shallower, faster. My hands are shaking slightly. I put them in my pockets to still them and stand in the overgrown backyard of my childhood home, surrounded by abandoned houses and whispering trees. And I try to think of an explanation that makes this make sense. Squatters wouldn't know what my desk looked like. No one broke in 30 years ago and reconstructed my childhood. That's not a thing that happens. There's an explanation. There's always an explanation. And I'm going to have to go inside to find out what it is. I walk back toward the front of the house. The front door is the rational choice. It's still locked, and trying to open it will be a clear commitment. A moment where I can still decide not to do this. The back door, I realize, is my actual target. The back door in a house this empty, this careful, might not be locked. Or it might be locked and I'll find out, which is also information I can live with. The backyard stretches between me and the house. The grass is thick and my legs are beginning to feel unreal. That strange sensation of moving without being sure that the movement is actually happening. The late afternoon is starting to shift toward evening. The light is changing. The colors are becoming less distinct. I reach the back door and turn the handle. It opens. The interior of my house is dark and cool and smells like a place that's been closed for a long time. Dust and stale air and something else, something organic and faint, like the earth smell from outside but contained, concentrated, kept behind walls and ceiling instead of dispersed into open air. I stand in the threshold and let my eyes adjust, and I find myself standing in what used to be the kitchen. The kitchen is different than I remember and exactly the same. The layout is correct. The location of the appliances aligns with memory, but the appliances themselves are gone, replaced by old wooden furniture. A table, a hutch, a cabinet with glass doors, all of it dark wood, all of it very old, nothing I recognize. The room is empty except for these pieces, and it's so quiet that I can hear the sound of my own pulse, that deep rhythmic throb, like something alive and trapped inside my chest. I step inside and close the door behind me. The dust on the wooden table is not uniform. There are patterns in it, long streaks, as if something has been dragged across the surface recently. I trace one with my finger and it comes away gray and fine, coating the whorls of my fingerprint. The streaks form no particular shape, but they suggest movement, and movement suggests presence, and I don't want to think about what presence would mean in an empty house on an empty street in a place that shouldn't exist. I move deeper into the kitchen. The hutch holds no dishes, just empty shelves behind warped glass that distorts everything slightly, making the kitchen behind it seem liquid and uncertain. The cabinet beside it is the same, bare wood interior, nothing stored, nothing kept. It's as if someone had arranged these pieces here as a stage setting. All the furniture but none of the function. A kitchen that could never feed anyone. A kitchen that existed only to be seen. The doorway to the dining room is dark. I can make out the shape of something large in there. The dining table, probably my dining table. I remember it exactly. Dark wood, 6 chairs, a scratch on the underside of the top from when my father moved it too quickly across hardwood flooring. I remember running my thumb across that scratch while sitting beneath the table as a child, hiding from something I've now forgotten. Before I can convince myself to move toward it, I hear the sound. It comes from above. A soft creaking, the kind of noise a house makes when wood settles, when temperature and humidity shift the frame slightly. Completely normal, completely explainable. Houses make noise. Empty houses, especially without the insulation of people and furniture and daily life, they're more audible, more prone to transmitting every small movement of their structure to the listening air. But the creaking doesn't stop. It continues, a slow, rhythmic sound, and it's moving. I can track it by ear, from the center of the house toward the east wall, toward what would have been the hallway. The sound of weight shifting across floorboards. The sound of something walking. I tell myself, old houses settle. Wind moves through attics. Animals nest in spaces where humans no longer maintain barriers. The creaking stops. The silence that follows is worse than the sound. My breathing is louder now. The pulse in my chest has accelerated into something I can feel in my fingertips. I'm standing in the center of a kitchen in a house that was buried under earth and ivy and time. And upstairs in that house, something has stopped moving. I move toward the hallway. I need to see the rest of it. I need to understand what's happening here. And understanding requires information. And information requires me to keep going. This is the logic that keeps me moving forward through the darkness. This is the voice I'm listening to instead of the one that's suggesting very clearly that I should turn around and walk back out through that open door and never come back. The hallway is lined with doors. I count them as I pass. 1, 2, 3. 3 doors on the left side of the hallway, all of them closed. I don't remember this. I don't remember my childhood home having quite this many doors, quite this much hidden space. Or maybe I do remember, and the memory has been buried along with everything else, compressed under the weight of intervening years. The first door is locked. I don't try to force it. I just touch the handle, feel the resistance, and move on. The second door opens easily, revealing a bedroom. My bedroom, maybe, or someone's. A twin bed with a metal frame, stripped of all bedding. A small dresser. A window with the blinds closed. Though how anything remains closed after 30 years of abandonment is a question I'm not equipped to answer. The room is exactly as empty as everything else, and somehow that emptiness is more disturbing than if it had been full of my things, full of evidence of occupation. I close the door and lean against it for a moment. My breathing is more controlled now. I'm moving into a state of suspended acceptance, that strange mental space where you stop questioning the basic premise of what's happening and instead focus on processing the details. This house exists. I'm inside it. Everything I'm seeing can be explained if I think about it hard enough, if I arrange the facts correctly in my mind. The third door opens onto stairs. The basement stairs. I have a clear memory of these. The steepness of them, the way the light from upstairs never quite reached the bottom, the smell that would come up sometimes, earthy and cool and vaguely threatening to a child's imagination. My father used the basement for storage. Tools mostly, things he was working on. I was not encouraged to go down there. I don't go down now either. I just stand at the threshold and look at the darkness below, at the way the stairs seem to descend into something that light doesn't reach. Something about the geometry of that darkness seems wrong. It seems to extend too far, to drop away more steeply than a basement should. Or perhaps it's just that I can't see the bottom. And the eye is very good at feeling in unseen spaces with depths that might not actually exist. I turn away and continue down the hallway. The living room is where I expected it to be, but it's not. Not quite. The proportions are off. The room is larger than it should be, the ceiling higher, the walls positioned at angles that don't quite line up with the exterior of the house as I remember seeing it. My couch is here, the one I left behind, the one I stopped thinking about years ago. It's positioned against the far wall, facing the window. The fabric is faded but intact. No animals have nested in it. No decay has set in. It's as if it's been sitting here, waiting, undisturbed by anything except time. The television set sits on the old wooden stand in the corner. Not the television I left behind, but an older one, bulky, heavy-looking, the kind with a curved screen. There's a layer of dust on top of it, but the dust is fresh, within days fresh. I can tell because I ran my finger through the dust on the table, and this dust has a similar weight and consistency, but the depth of it is less. Something has been here. Something has used this room. I notice the magazines on the side table. There are only 3 of them, stacked neatly, corners aligned. They're old, the covers are faded, the paper yellowed. I pick up the top one, and the date on the spine reads 1993. 30 years old, exactly as old as my abandonment of this place. The magazine smells like paper that's been kept in darkness for decades, that musty archive smell. I flip it open, and the pages are still flexible, not brittle. Someone has been preserving these. Someone has taken care to maintain them. I set it back down and sit on the edge of the couch. The cushions compress under my weight exactly as I remember them compressing, with exactly the same give and resistance. The fabric is rougher than my memory of it, worn slightly, but otherwise it's the same object. This is my couch. This is my house. This is a space that should not exist, and yet I'm sitting on its furniture in its darkness. And nothing about this makes sense. The creaking from upstairs happens again. It's slower this time, more deliberate. Not the random settling of an old structure, but something that sounds distinctly like footsteps. 1, 2, 3, a pause. 2 more. The rhythm of someone walking from one side of the room to another. I stand up. My hands are shaking. The footsteps stop directly above me. I can feel their position in the ceiling, center of the room perhaps, or slightly toward the wall. Waiting, listening, and I realize that I'm listening too. That I've been holding my breath. That the only sound in the house is my own heartbeat. The creaking starts again, moving now toward what would be the hallway above. Moving toward the stairs. I hear the first step on the upper stairs creak under weight, then the second. I move without deciding to move, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. I'm back in the hallway, moving toward the front door. Behind me I can hear the creaking continuing, each step an audible event, a descent. The front door is locked, but I know that the back door opened easily. And I'm already moving toward the kitchen when I hear the footsteps reach the bottom of the basement stairs. But there shouldn't be footsteps in the basement. The footsteps were upstairs. There are footsteps in both places. The sound is coming from above and below simultaneously, echoing through the house, multiplying in the darkness and dust. I reach the kitchen just as I hear my name called from somewhere deep in the structure of the house. A voice I almost recognize, speaking in a tone I almost remember. The back door opens at the first push. I don't close it behind me. I walk out into the darkening yard, and the last thing I hear before I move beyond the threshold of sound is that voice calling again, persistent and patient, speaking a name that hasn't belonged to me in 30 years. When I turn to look back at the house, every window is dark except one. The window of what I now understand was my childhood bedroom. There's a light on inside, a soft glow, and at the center of that glow is a shape, a silhouette. A figure standing at the window, looking out, looking at me. I walk until the house is behind me, until the trees have swallowed the roof line and the glow from that single window becomes just another sickly star caught in the canopy. My breathing is ragged, uncontrolled. I can feel my legs moving beneath me, but they don't feel like my legs. They feel like something I'm observing rather than controlling, a puppet's approximation of flight. The yard gives way to the skeletal remains of what used to be a driveway. The asphalt is buckled in places, seams split open with weeds pushing through like bones breaking skin. I follow it without thinking about where it leads, moving on instinct toward anywhere that isn't that house, anywhere that isn't facing that impossible bedroom window. I don't know how long I've been walking when I realize I can hear footsteps behind me. Not on the cracked driveway, through the trees, in the brush. Multiple sets, moving at different speeds, none of them making any attempt at stealth. They're not trying to catch up, they're simply matching my pace, maintaining distance, the way a predator will track prey without rushing. I don't turn around. I can feel looking back would be a mistake. something my instinct understands even if my conscious mind is too fractured to articulate it. Instead, I walk faster, and the footsteps in the trees accelerate to match. The driveway opens onto a cul-de-sac I don't remember. There are other houses here, more than I saw before, 5, maybe 6, arranged in a loose circle around a small patch of dead lawn. They're all in the same state of decay as the first one, windows dark, structures slowly returning to earth. The driveways are cracked and buckled like the one I walked, and as I move through the cul-de-sac, I notice that each house has a number on its mailbox, painted in white numerals that are somehow still readable despite the decades of exposure. The numbers are sequential. I stop in the center of the cul-de-sac, standing in the dead grass, and turn to face the tree line. The footsteps have stopped. The tree line is a solid wall of shadow and densely packed trunks. Nothing moving, nothing visible. But something is waiting there. I can feel it the way you feel heat radiating from pavement, not directly observed, but absolutely present. The absence of sensation becoming itself a kind of presence. A voice calls from the darkest part of the woods. It's the same voice from the house, and this time I recognize it. It's my own voice. It calls my name with an inflection I haven't heard since I was 9 years old, a particular rise at the end, a rhythm that belonged to a specific person calling me in from play when the sun had gotten too low and the shadows had begun to pool in the yards. That exact person, that exact voice. It calls again, and a second voice joins it, slightly different in timbre but unmistakably mine as well, layered over the first, then a third, all of them calling from different points in the forest, all of them using that same inflection, that same name, creating a chorus of myself surrounding the cul-de-sac. The footsteps resume. Multiple sets, moving between the houses now, crossing driveways, stepping over buckled concrete. I can hear them, but I still can't see anything beyond vague shadows, shapes that don't quite cohere into bodies. They're moving to every side of me, circling, the footsteps echoing off the abandoned houses and multiplying until I can't tell if there are 3 of them or 30. I move toward the nearest house, the one directly to my left. Its front door is swollen in the frame, painted in a color that might have been blue 40 years ago. I shoulder into it, and the wood splinters, crumbles, breaking apart with almost no resistance. The interior is instantly around me, immediate and suffocating. Darkness that's somehow thicker than the night outside. Air that tastes like decay and preservation. The archaeological smell of a place suspended between ruin and maintenance. I slam the door behind me and immediately know it's the wrong decision. The footsteps are inside the house with me now. I can hear them in the hallway, in other rooms, in walls. They're everywhere, moving through the structure of the building with casual familiarity. One of the voices calls from upstairs. Another responds from what sounds like the basement. They're having a conversation now, a dialogue conducted in my own voice, back and forth, casual, the way people speak when they're playing a game they've played 1,000 times. I move toward the back of the house, toward what should be a kitchen and find a window instead. It's grimy enough that the outside world is barely visible, but I can see the tree line past the dead yard. The silhouette of a path I didn't notice before, an opening in the woods that looks like it might lead somewhere. The window is painted shut. The frame cracks as I pull, old paint flaking like skin, and then the glass is up and I'm climbing through, rough wood catching at my clothes. The air outside suddenly clean and breathable and so cold it burns. I run toward the opening in the trees. Behind me, the multiple voices rise in unison, speaking my name with such synchronized precision that it sounds less like language and more like a bell being rung, the same note repeating, echoing across the subdivision. The footsteps pour out of the house, dozens of them now, surrounding the cul-de-sac, but none of them seem interested in following me into the forest. They stop at the tree line and wait. I keep running into the darkness between the trunks, and the forest narrows around me, becomes denser, the trees pressing closer until I have to push branches aside to move forward. There's still light here, somehow a kind of ambient glow that comes from nowhere and everything at once, just enough to see a few feet ahead. I run for what might be minutes or might be hours. Time feels unstable here, compressed and stretched simultaneously. The forest never changes. The same trees, the same pattern of undergrowth, the same glow. It feels like the trees themselves are moving, repositioning subtly to keep me in the same place while giving the illusion of progress. Then I see the sign. It's nailed to a tree at chest height, the wood weathered, but the letters still visible, subdivided 1989. Welcome home. Below that, carved into the tree itself, much older, is another message. I have to lean close to read it, tracing the letters with my finger. The words are carved so deep that the wood has grown around them, incorporating them, making them part of the tree's anatomy he never left. The forest around me suddenly makes a sound. Not the sounds of trees or wind or animals, a sound like breathing, like the forest itself taking in air, holding it, remembering that breath. The glow intensifies, becomes almost visible as a presence, like light falling through water. Behind me, somewhere in the direction I came from, someone is walking through the forest. The footsteps are slow, deliberate, making no attempt to be quiet. One of my voices is humming something, a lullaby, maybe, or something closer to it. A song I haven't heard since someone used to sing it in a room with pale walls while I was falling asleep. I move deeper into the trees, away from the voice and the footsteps, deeper toward the heart of the forest that may or may not be a forest at all, following the only path that seems available, understanding finally that the subdivision isn't a place you escape from, but a place you're allowed to leave again and again, each time believing it's the first time. Each time finding your way back to that house with your furniture inside it, that house that has somehow always been waiting. The voice calling my name grows closer, and the forest breathes around me, patient and inevitable. I don't remember stopping running. There's a moment lost somewhere in that impossible stretch of trees, where the humming becomes so familiar, so achingly specific in its incompleteness that I simply cease. My legs stop, my breath stops, the forest stops, and then I'm standing on a road I recognize. It's the old county route, the one that borders the subdivisions, 4 lanes of cracked asphalt that separates the developed lots from the wild land beyond. There are streetlights here, their pale orange glow reaching down like tired hands. One of them flickers in that familiar pattern, on for 3 seconds, off for 2. A rhythm that feels like a pulse, like something vast and injured trying to signal for help. My car is parked on the shoulder where I left it. The doors are unlocked. The keys are still in the ignition. When I start the engine, it turns over immediately, as though it's been running all along and I'm simply now aware of it. I drive away from the forest. I don't look in the rearview mirror until I reach the town limits, and by then the trees have already receded into the darkness behind me, indistinguishable from any other woods, any other forgotten place at the edge of civilization. The drive home takes 40 minutes. I know this because the clock on my dashboard says 11:47 when I leave and 12:27 when I arrive. The logic is sound. The mathematics check out. But the time feels wrong in a way I can't articulate, compressed and distended, like a film played at slightly the wrong speed. My apartment is exactly as I left it. The dishes are still in the sink. The book I was reading is still open on the couch, the bookmark still on page 187. Nothing has been disturbed. Nothing has changed. The world has simply continued in my absence, indifferent to whether I'm in it or not. I shower. I try to sleep. For 3 hours I lie in bed and wait for exhaustion to do its work, and when sleep finally comes, it arrives like a weight, absolute and suffocating, the kind of sleep where you don't dream because you're too far under, sunk into something that feels less like rest and more like drowning in slow motion. The next morning is Thursday. I know this because my alarm goes off at 6:45, the same as always, and the day of the week displays itself across my phone screen with the casual certainty of something that has never been questioned, never been wrong. I go through the motions of existence. I shower again. I eat toast that tastes like cardboard. I drive to work. My office is on the 7th floor of a glass building downtown. The elevator has never failed me. The fluorescent lights have never flickered. My desk is in the same location it's always been. And my coworkers greet me with the same degree of casual indifference they always have, which is to say, they acknowledge my existence with a nod and a murmur and immediately return to their screens. No one asks where I've been. No one seems to have noticed I was gone. But there's something different about the way they look at me when they think I'm not paying attention. A hesitation, a slight widening of the eyes, the expression you might have if you were looking at someone you expected to see again, but were mildly surprised to find them still intact, still real, still capable of sitting in a chair and pretending to work. I try not to think about the Subdivision. For 2 days I almost succeed. It's on Saturday afternoon, while I'm buying groceries, that I begin to remember small details. The way the paint on the window frame had flaked in patterns that resembled continents. The specific shade of beige the furniture was painted. The names of everyone inside the house, all of them variations of my own, all of them speaking in unison, all of them certain of what they were asking me to accept as truth. I buy the groceries. I pay. I drive home. But on the way, I take a different route, and I find myself on the county road again, and I see the turnoff to the subdivisions, and I feel something in my chest that might be dread, but might be longing. I don't turn. I drive past. I tell myself it was just a glance. For 3 weeks, the feeling subsides. I develop a routine. Work, home, sleep, work again. The rhythms of normal lift additional middle section, the silence of the subdivision, was the kind that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Not the peaceful silence of a countryside morning, but something that pressed against your ears like cotton soaked in cold water. I stood at the edge of what must have been a cul-de-sac once. Now it was just a circle of cracked asphalt with grass and thin saplings punching through the breaks, their growth so patient and inevitable that the pavement seemed almost embarrassed by its own deterioration. The houses arranged around me were all variations on the same theme. 2-story colonials with vinyl siding that had grayed to the color of old teeth. Shutters hung at angles where wind had worked them loose year after year. Some were missing entirely, leaving dark, rectangular wounds on the facades. The gutters sagged with the weight of accumulated needles and leaves, and I could see where water had run down the walls in permanent brown streaks, like something was weeping from the roofline. My breath was visible in the air. It wasn't that cold. The temperature was probably in the mid-40s, but the damp got into your chest here. Everything smelled of mulch and slow rot. Not the sharp decay of something recently dead, but the deep, earthy smell of years of leaves breaking down into soil, of wood gradually surrendering its grain, of the patient work of fungi and time. There was an undertone, too, something like rust and stale water, maybe from a pool somewhere or standing moisture in basements. I moved deeper into the subdivision, and my footsteps on the asphalt sounded too loud. Each step was a small betrayal of quiet. I could hear the settled crunch of gravel embedded in the pavement, the catch of my shoe on an uneven section, but underneath that was something else, a faint sound I couldn't quite locate. A dripping, perhaps, or the settling of a structure. It stopped when I stopped walking, which made it worse somehow. The subdivision seemed to only breathe when I wasn't paying attention. The vegetation was doing something I'd never quite seen before. It wasn't wild growth exactly. This wasn't a forest reclaiming civilization. It was more deliberate than that, more purposeful. Vines had twisted up the mailboxes so completely that you could barely see the metal underneath, only the smooth green spirals that had consumed them. Ivy climbed the brick chimneys in precise, almost geometric patterns. But the lawns themselves were strange. They weren't overgrown in the traditional sense. Instead, they'd become something else. The grass had turned gray-green and impossibly thick, so dense that when I stepped off the asphalt, onto what had been someone's front yard, it felt like walking on a cushion, and my foot sank slightly with a soft, damp give. It had the texture of moss, almost, something that thrived in shadow and moisture. I was acutely aware that I was the only thing here that was warm. Everything else, the brick, the asphalt, the grass, the still air itself, existed in a state of cool stillness. My body heat felt like a small, obvious thing, something that didn't belong. The back of my neck prickled with that feeling, that specific awareness of being the only warm animal in a cold space. The windows were a problem I kept avoiding looking at directly. They were all dark, which made sense, but it was the kind of dark that suggested something more than simply the absence of light. A few still had curtains drawn tightly, faded floral patterns barely visible behind the dust. Most had lost their coverings, and you could see into the darkness beyond. Just black, utterly black, no matter what time of day it was. I realized I was breathing through my mouth instead of my nose, which meant my throat was dry and tight. I corrected myself, forced myself back to nasal breathing, but the air felt thin. There was a mailbox at the end of one driveway that still had a name on it. The metal numbers still readable, 847. I didn't look at the name. The driveway itself was buckled where tree roots had grown underneath the asphalt, creating a series of small hills and valleys. Standing at the top of the drive, looking toward the house, I could feel the weight of it. Not physical weight, actual weight, but the sensation of being pulled slightly downward, as if this place had its own minor gravity. The house was set back from the street, and between me and its entrance, the vegetation grew even more thickly. There were shrubs I couldn't identify, their leaves a strange blue-gray color, and small trees, no more than 8 or 9 feet tall, that seemed to lean slightly as if they were listening. The air didn't move. I've been in many quiet places, but usually there's some air current, some slight motion. Here the air was static. A strand of spiderweb caught between 2 branches hung perfectly vertical, and when I looked around, I could see dozens of them, all still as thread. It gave the whole scene a quality of suspension, as if the subdivision was being held in some specific moment and nothing here was allowed to progress into the next one. I found myself counting the houses. On the left side of the cul-de-sac, 5. On the right side, 5. One at the far end with a double lot, 11 houses total. All of them in this state of perfect, patient decline. And somewhere among them, I could feel it the way an animal feels the presence of water, was the one I'd come looking for. The one that shouldn't have what it had. The sound came again, that faint dripping. It seemed to come from the house with the double lot, but when I turned to look, there was no visible source. Just the dark windows and the perfectly still vegetation surrounding it. The dripping sound stopped. The silence re-established itself like a held breath released. I realized I'd been standing in one spot for several minutes without moving. My legs had started to feel cold. Established themselves like water-finding channels, like the world settling into familiar grooves. I stopped thinking about the humming. I stop replaying the image of the sign nailed to that tree, the words carved so deep they'd become part of the wood substance, incorporated into something ancient. But small things refused to leave. The lullaby, the one the voice was singing in the forest, returns at odd moments. In the shower, while I'm driving. Once, very clearly, while I'm standing in line at a coffee shop, and I have to grip the counter because the memory of it is so visceral, so specific in its wrongness, that my body forgets how to breathe for several seconds. There's a voice in my apartment sometimes. Not voices, plural, but a single voice, mine, but not quite. It's humming. It's always humming the same incomplete melody, stopping at the same phrase, as though it's waiting for me to remember the next line. It doesn't matter where I am or what I'm doing. I'll be reading, and I'll become aware of it, a sound that's almost beneath hearing, almost certainly a product of my own mind, and yet so consistent, so patient, that it begins to feel less like a hallucination and more like a conversation I'm losing one word at a time. My apartment is exactly where it should be, 45 minutes from the subdivision, in a building with 7 other units, on a street with other buildings, surrounded by the architecture of normal life. But sometimes, in the early morning before the city fully wakes, I can almost smell something like undisturbed furniture, like rooms that have been sealed for a very long time, waiting for someone to come back and reclaim them. I've thought about returning to the forest, not every day, but often enough that I've stopped trying to convince myself the impulse will eventually fade. I know the way. Or rather, I know a way. The road. The turnoff. The subdivision that doesn't quite exist, but is more real than anything else I've encountered. The house that is somehow the same house regardless of which direction I approach it from, the furniture inside it still arranged in the exact configuration of my own apartment. A mirror that's off by degrees too subtle to name but impossible to ignore. I haven't gone back. But I can feel the invitation extending outward, patient and inevitable, like branches growing toward a window, like the forest breathing on the other side of glass, like something that has all the time in the world waiting for me to remember that I never actually left, that the drive home was just the forest moving through different shapes, still trees but in different arrangements, still that same ambient glow but coming from a different direction, still the same place, really. The same place I'm standing in right now, in my apartment, listening to the humming grow slightly louder, slightly more distinct, becoming almost audible as a word instead of just a sound, and the lullaby finally beginning to complete itself.